All right, well, as we continue in our series now of understanding the big picture of the Bible, we're now looking at the storyline of the Bible. And as we've said, to try to help us understand the storyline of the Bible, we are breaking it down into four main acts or movements. They're sort of like the acts or movements of like a play or a movie. This kind of just helps us to understand the plot line of the Bible as it moves along. And so we've already seen the first act, which was called Beginnings. And in that act, we talked about the first scene, which was creation, how God created the world and everything in it. And then the second scene was the fall, how though God had created everything good, ultimately our choice as humans was to sin and to mess it all up. And so the result of our sin was that the whole world became broken. And so we saw now how the whole rest of the Bible, the whole rest of the story of the Bible is about what God is doing in the world to restore his creation, to redeem what was broken by sin. We're going to see the great lengths that God goes through to bring us back to that state before our relationship with him was broken because of sin. And so now we're going to begin Act 2, and we're going to see how God begins this process of restoring the world back to himself. And we're going to see how the first way that he begins to do this is through a nation that he will create and develop called Israel. And so Act 2 is simply called Israel. Now, if you're familiar with the Bible at all, hopefully Israel will be a familiar concept to you, because the whole rest of the Old Testament story is all about the nation of Israel, how God is working in and through this nation of Israel to restore people back to himself. Now, as in all of our acts, we're going to look at it in a couple different scenes. And the first scene we're going to look at in Act 2, Israel, is the scene called Promise. And this first scene is all about the initial promise that God gives to the people of Israel. And actually, this promise begins not with a nation, but with one person, the person who would become the father of the nation, and that is Abraham. You see, when God begins this scene, there is no nation of Israel. There are just people scattered around the world. And from all those nations, God chose one man, this man named Abram, who would later change his name to Abraham. But he chooses Abraham, and it says later in the Bible, it wasn't because he was such a great person or anything like that, but God had a sovereign plan to choose this man Abraham, and then to work through him to begin this work of drawing people back to himself. And so Abraham is the father of the nation of Israel. And he is the one who is the initial recipient of this promise of God. And so God comes to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, and that's where we discover this promise that God gives to him. So look now at this promise that God gives to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, the first 3 verses. It says this: "The Lord had said to Abram, leave your country and your people and your father's household and go to the land I will show you. And I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you." And later it says, "And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So this is this initial promise that God gives to him. And I want you to notice a few key elements in this promise. First, notice it talks about how God is going to lead him to a land. And so the first element of promise is that God is going to give him some great land. And then it says, "I'm going to make you into a great nation." That is the same word for people. God is going to bless him with lots of people. He's going to make him a very prosperous nation filled with people. And then finally, he says that the whole world will be blessed through you. And so ultimately, this nation will be a blessing unto the entire world. And so really, God comes to Abraham and he makes this threefold promise that includes land, people, and blessing. This is the foundational promise that God gives, as he is saying that he is going to be drawing the world back to himself, and he's going to do that by fulfilling these promises of land, people, and blessing. And so the rest of the story of the Bible is the unfolding of God coming through on these promises. And what we're going to discover is that there is a temporal fulfillment of these promises, but there is also, we'll see, an eternal fulfillment of these promises as well. And so the whole rest of the story of the Bible is God unfolding these promises and him coming through on his word. So go ahead and take a minute now and pause and discuss these questions with your group.